So let's get started. Welcome everybody to this, our second webinar on biodiversity credits. I'm Alistair Scott. I've recently become the Executive Director of the Global Rewilding Alliance, and we're delighted to be here hosting this webinar with Plan Vivo and VERRA, and a number of outstanding case study projects from around the world. I'd just like to give you an idea of the running order. So after me, Gregor Pipan, who is a board member of the Global Rewilding Alliance, will give an introduction on the substance of today's webinar. And then we will have, I think, 6 or 7 speakers. And if I can just introduce you in turn, please. So firstly, Dr. Toril Shah from Plan Vivo, who's the biodiversity coordinator. Do you want to wave, Toril? There you are. That's great. And secondly, Dr. Diana Nalwanga, who is in Uganda. Do you want to wave, Diana? Yes, there we are. Great. Who's the biodiversity lead at EcoTrust. Thirdly, Dr. Amy Tom from VERRA. There's Amy there on your screen, who's the Manager of Sustainable Development Innovation at VERRA, one of the platforms. Then next, Jill Orhun, who is the Head of Operations and Technology at Pontera. There's Jill, working in Panama. And Hubert Shigiel, who is also on this project. And then finally, Preeti Sridharan, who is the Nature and Carbon Project Manager at Wildaway. There's Shriti there. And Andre Couto, who I'm not sure, Andre, if you're here. Are you here yet? If you are, then please wave. Yes, Andre, there you are. Fantastic. Great. So those are the introductions. Without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Gregor Pipan. Gregor.
Thank you, Alistair. Rewilding today is increasingly seen as a beacon of hope for reversing the negative trends in biodiversity, where almost 70% of wildlife populations have been lost in the last half a century. However, it is clear that public sources alone cannot provide sufficient funding to meet nature conservation, restoration, and enhancement needs. So it is estimated that the funding gap in question is exceeding $700 billion annually. So the search is on for financial instruments and mechanisms that could unlock private financial flows for nature conservation and restoration. In the webinar a couple of months ago, which is now available also on YouTube, we presented how biodiversity credits can generate financial flows for habitat restoration, species reintroduction and conservation, ecosystem protections, and sustainable land management practices. We also hosted some of the actors in this space, specifically the project developers. The objective of this webinar today is, however, to present the role that biodiversity credit standard setters play in the biodiversity credit generation process and a few projects adhering to the specific standards. Standard setters play a crucial role by establishing the guidelines, the methodologies, and best practices that ensure credibility, transparency, and effectiveness in biodiversity conservation efforts. Their key responsibilities include, for example, developing standards and methodologies, as the name says, verification and certification of the credits, harmonization and alignment, stakeholder engagement, and also market development and scalability. So to kick off this webinar, I would like to invite Dr. Toril Shah, the biodiversity coordinator at Plan Vivo, to present the Plan Vivo's biodiversity standard, Keeping Nature. So Toril, floor is all yours.
Thank you, Gregor, and thanks everyone for the invitation to present to you today. Whilst the slides are loading, just to give a little bit of an overview to how we're going to start. We thought we would take this opportunity to build on what Gregor has already introduced and give a little bit of an insight to the principles behind the process of issuing high integrity biodiversity credits or biodiversity certificates, specifically through standard setters like Plan Vivo and VERRA, who are here today, and showcase the role that standard setters play. So as a standard setter, we have the responsibility to ensure that credits are issued through credible mechanisms, and that comes out through a number of principles. So first off, we want to ensure that the outcomes are certified, and that is through independent standards. We have to follow a set of globally relevant rules that all the projects must adhere to, and this also includes requirements around project design and also monitoring. We ensure that the development of our methodologies is scientifically informed, and that leads to sound project interventions, and that we have embedded within the approach environmental and social safeguards that ensure the projects take appropriate mitigation measures to avoid as many risks as possible. In terms of the project design, a core part of our standards process includes that the project design is reviewed by experts, technical reviewers, similar to a peer review approach, where technical and design aspects of the project are third-party reviewed. Linked to third party, we also have auditing requirements. So this ensures not only that the project is compliant with the standards requirements, but has ongoing integrity in terms of implementation, particularly around verifying the outcomes over time. And then when we talk about credit issuance, we ensure that the issuance is done in a transparent manner through publicly accessible registries. Next. So building on these principles, all standard setters have core environmental, social, and governance requirements. Namely, we ensure that all the projects have the ability and have clearly demonstrated additionality, that the methodologies that we use to quantify biodiversity impact have been developed through stakeholder participation. They have all undergone public consultation, often more than one consultation process, that enables the responsive iteration of the feedback into the final approaches. As standard setters, we ensure project design has the inclusion of Indigenous peoples and local communities, and that the requirements overall are promoting an evidence-based approach. Next. And I'll hand it over to Amy now, actually, to talk more about the cycle.
Thanks very much, Toril. We thought it might be useful for those in the audience who may not be so familiar with how a certified crediting project operates, just to give a high-level overview of the project cycle. How does the actual process play out? And I think it's important to note that each standard setter might have distinct steps in the project cycle that could differ slightly from what's depicted here, but this is certainly the core steps that are similar in both VERRA's and Plan Vivo's methodologies. So first, a project proponent develops a concept for a biodiversity project, since we're here talking about biodiversity credits today, and then submits that project description documentation, so a full package of documentation outlining the project design and how the project has followed all of the requirements in that given methodology, and that's submitted to the standard setter, who then reviews that documentation for completeness, and then publishes documents in a public-facing platform, and typically opens a public comment period, so an opportunity for the general public to offer their comments, their critiques of the overall project design. And then the project proponent contracts an independent third-party auditor. We typically refer to them as a validation and verification body, or a VVB. And that independent auditor then reviews not only the project documentation for accuracy in a desktop review, but typically also conducts a site visit to assess the project's compliance in implementation on the ground with all of the requirements in that particular methodology. And the findings from that third-party audit are then submitted to the standard setter, who reviews that report and the findings alongside the project's documentation. And then the project is registered in a public registry. So all of the documentation and all of the other information about that project, including the report from the validation and verification body, is publicly accessible for transparency. And after a given period, which can differ between standard setters or methodologies, the project pursues what's called verification. So the validation and verification body would verify the outcomes that the project is claiming, and the standard setter would approve that project's credit issuance. And so the credits are then issued to the project proponent, who sells them directly to investors. It could be companies or corporations, investment funds, other kinds of intermediaries, such as brokers. The buyer is making that investment in biodiversity projects with high integrity, third-party verified outcomes. And the project proponent then uses those credit revenues to reinvest into the project itself to carry on with implementation. And typically there's also equitable benefit sharing that's happening with the impacted stakeholders. And so this is just a general overview of how a typical crediting project cycle would work in a certified standard setting context. Next slide, please. And we thought it would just be relevant also to think right now and present to sort of set the stage about how biodiversity credits differ from carbon credits. And so biodiversity credits can't be used to offset or compensate for negative impacts on nature. There is no like for like in the scenario of biodiversity credits, of course. And unlike carbon, there's not a single universally applicable quantification for a biodiversity credit. One ton of CO2 equivalent is 1 ton, no matter where you're at in the world. But the value of biodiversity in one part of the world, in one ecosystem, is not necessarily equivalent to the same biodiversity in a different part of the world, in a different ecosystem, or even sometimes in the same ecosystem. So there is no one-size-fits-all quantification. But biodiversity crediting methodologies allow for that variation in project context, in ecosystem contexts, different project activities, different ecosystem condition indicators, different monitoring approaches. And so in this way, biodiversity credits, especially as we're seeing this in this brand new space for conservation finance, do differ in these very specific ways from carbon credits. Next slide, and I believe we'll be handing back to Toril to start the presentation for Plan Vivo.
Thanks, Amy. Yes, so I'm now going to go into the Plan Vivo Biodiversity Standard, showing you how it's an opportunity to deliver impact for nature, climate, and people through inclusive nature-based solutions. Next slide, please. So very briefly, for those of you who are not familiar with Plan Vivo, we are a charitable foundation. We've been working for over 25 years supporting smallholder farmers and also climate-sensitive communities across the world to access nature markets, predominantly the voluntary carbon market, to develop sustainable land use projects. So today, the foundation currently operates 2 standards, the long-standing carbon standard, known as PV Climate, and the more recently launched biodiversity standard, PV Nature. And our model is quite unique. We really try to put smallholders and communities at the center of the project design, the governance, and the operation of the project. Next slide, please. So as I said, more recently, we've been trying to expand our reach with the launch of the Plan Vivo Biodiversity Standard. And this has really evolved through building on the Plan Vivo model and through those values and experiences learned from our carbon certified projects. Of course, this is also in recognition of the current global biodiversity crisis and the impact we're facing across the world. But we do want to learn from and build synergies between the new emerging biodiversity market and the existing voluntary carbon market. Particularly by ensuring that these certificates are issued through high integrity mechanisms and the claims are credible. And that is linked to some of the principles I talked about at the start. Next slide, please. So what is the Plan Vivo Biodiversity Standard? It is a certification to enable the issuance of biodiversity certificates or biodiversity credits. It's a financial mechanism that ensures smallholders, local communities, and indigenous peoples can access nature markets and also enables the channeling of responsible finance to these communities so that resources can be mobilized and biodiversity conservation and restoration is incentivized. And this schematic at the bottom here is just to show the collaborative effort behind the development of the standard. We didn't do this in isolation. We held multiple working groups, both from a technical and market perspective. We had input from projects across the world. We ran multiple public consultations and technical reviews, gathering feedback from various actors. And we had lots of core partners involved in the initial development of the standard. Of course, always ensuring alignment with wider groups and networks. Next slide, please. And high integrity has always been a focus for Plan Vivo. Very early on in our journey along this standard development in January 2023, we developed some core principles for high integrity markets along with fauna and flora and carbon Tanzania. And this is really to ensure that the certificates issued through PV Nature are representative of additional and verifiable benefits, not just for biodiversity, but for people and climate as well. Importantly, our standard is not to be used for offsets, but as I mentioned, as an incentive for sustainable land use and management. And more recently, we're continuing to stay aligned with high-level principles generated or developed through joint collaboration of Biodiversity Credit Alliance, International Advisory Panel for Biodiversity Credits, and the World Economic Forum, which was released late last year in COP16. Next slide, please. So what does the PV Nature standard entail? Some of the core requirements are around land rights. So this ensures that members of the community have the right to manage, to have the rights of the land. And this needs to be held exclusively by community members, with only 30% being able to be managed by outside entities. There are exceptions to this where private landowners or government areas can be included within the standard, but this still needs to ensure a participation of local communities within the project design. The second is around land management. So participants need to have the right to manage the land, either proven by various land tenure models or customary land tenure, or other legal or binding agreements between landowners and participants. And then in terms of the interventions, these need to be nature-based around biodiversity conservation and restoration or improved land management. Next slide, please. And of course, there are a number of other requirements. You can look at them in our requirement documentation, but we focus strongly on stakeholder engagement and free, prior, informed consent. As I mentioned earlier, there is a focus as well on ensuring safeguards and appropriate risk mitigation measures are accounted for. And all projects need to have a sort of realistic theory of change or a logic that flows over time with the ability to have adaptive management, particularly with our changing environment. Importantly for Plan Vivo, projects need to generate a benefit sharing mechanism with the local communities. We have a requirement around a minimum of 60% revenue from the sale of the certificates needs to return into the management and hands of the community. There are other requirements around the methodology and monitoring, which I will talk about in a moment, and then, of course, the auditing requirements. Next slide, please. So how do we monitor and measure biodiversity impact? I'm not going to go into too many technical details, but give you a good feel for the methodology overall. Next slide, please. So biodiversity under PV Nature ensures that the certificates that are generated from these projects represent positive outcomes for biodiversity, either through restoration or conservation action. The methodology describes the effort required to monitor biodiversity impact in a standardized way, but it is not the entirety of the monitoring that a project can or could undertake if they wish. Next slide, please. So some of the choices behind the approach. For Plan Vivo, it's very important to have community engagement throughout the project process, and this includes involvement in the monitoring. We also wanted to have an approach that enables the project to scale up and expand over time, but remain cost-effective. And that we want to ensure credibility in the data that's collected and the way the credits are calculated by having data that can be audited independently by third parties and have an evidence-based approach. Results that can be compared and repeated over time, compared within projects and between projects, representing the same certificates from the same standard setter. And overall, we want to reduce any opportunity to sort of game the system or create biases within the data collection. We have two project types, conservation projects or restoration projects, and I will touch on those in more detail briefly in the next slides. Next slide, please. So how do we measure the impact? The methodology looks at two main data sets: species data looking at broad taxonomic groups, and habitat data looking at land use and connectivity. In order to get a very accurate picture of change, or as many statistically robust data assumptions as possible, we measure change annually, or we collect data annually in these projects. And the data is collected using digital recorders such as camera traps, acoustic sensors, other imagery technology. In terms of the analysis, this is done through a combination of machine learning to ensure scalability over time and landscapes, but also ensuring quality control by human expert annotation. And the idea of this methodology is not to be able to measure all living organisms within any single site, but rather to track a general trend in ecosystem health over time. And the unit we work with is a percentage change per hectare per year, which translates into number of certificates. Next slide, please. So I've touched briefly on this, but just to expand, in terms of the species data, we try to cover a broad taxonomic breadth as possible. We require terrestrial projects to monitor 4 target groups, including birds and low-lying plants, and a further 2 reflecting the ecological context and relevance to the site. For marine, our marine scheme is still in pilot phase, but we require projects to look at benthic vegetation and/or sessile invertebrates, as well as fish, and then other suitable taxonomic groups. As I said, the data is auditable through digital collection and also includes metadata, making that much easier, including geotagging and time and date stamps. And in terms of the sampling, we ensure annual random sampling in collaboration with the projects to ensure accessibility and safety, but also ensuring that sampling densities and minimum distances are incorporated into the sampling plan and stratified by habitat. Next slide, please. So, as I said, not getting into the technical details, but I wanted to give you a feel for the metrics that we are using here. So we use 5 well-established peer-reviewed metrics for tracking ecosystem change and health. The first 3 are species-based metrics: species richness, species diversity, including abundance and taxonomic dissimilarity. And then the last 2 there, pillar 4 and 5, are looking at habitat health and habitat spatial structure. The 5 metrics are aggregated into a single unit called the multi-metric, which is a percentage change per hectare per year. This data analysis is done by a third party, and the number of certificates generated from the project is informed to Plan Vivo for issuance in adherence with the rest of the standard. Next slide, please. So as I said, there are 2 project types. The first is a conservation type project. We do require eligibility to demonstrate the project is protecting existing high biodiversity value areas. This is through demonstrating the project triggers 1 key biodiversity area criteria or 2 important plant area criteria. And this means the project does not have to be a key biodiversity area or a designated important plant area. It's just about triggering 1 or 2 criteria respectively in order to demonstrate the project is protecting areas of existing high biodiversity value. If this is not the case, the project is then considered a restoration project. Next slide, please. So coming to the end here, I just wanted to give you an understanding of what one Plan Vivo biodiversity certificate represents, and this is an evidence-based outcome for biodiversity, climate, and communities. It needs to be additional and verified over time, and the unit related to this certificate is a percentage change per hectare per year. Next slide, please. This is just a quick overview of some of the PV Nature pipeline projects currently in development, globally spread, both terrestrial and marine, with loads of really interesting interventions, important areas for restoration and conservation, and of course, really core communities involved in these projects. And I think that's it from me. Next slide, please. If you want to learn more, there's lots of information on our website, but I will now hand it over to my colleague Diana, who will present a project example.
Thank you, Sarah. Presenting an example of one of the projects that Tora has presented in the map that she has just shared. It's from Uganda. And it's just giving a perspective from the community-led restoration. As you've seen, the plan Vivo standard requires that the projects are community-led, community-owned, and community-implemented. And that's what I just want to illustrate here, not going into the details that she has already gone through. Next slide, please. So in Uganda, we have a landscape restoration project, which is focused on restoring the forest corridor between two key biodiversity areas. We have a biodiversity area in Budongo in the far south, then there's in Bugoma, far south, and then Budongo in the north. And our project focuses on restoring the corridor landscape between those two. And the corridor landscape is mainly utilized by high wildlife density, mainly the eastern chimpanzees. And there are many interactions with the community. So our focus is to ensure that we find that line of best fit where you see the red lines and numbers, the red shades and numbers is the line of best fit where we think that if we restore those corridors, then the migration of the wildlife will be assured with minimum human-wildlife conflict. So that's our aim for this project. This project is a community-led project. In community land, the land itself is owned by the government, but the forests are owned by the community, if you understand. The communities have the rights to manage, to restore, and to utilize the forests as agreed in the management plans of these communities. Our project aims at effective recognition of these sites to ensure that all the communities have registered land, where they have the land titles, they have the rights, they own the rights to manage and to own the resources on the land. But also we ensure that the tenure is clarified, the boundaries are clear, and the management plans are also clear. And then we also ensure that the communities focus on restoration and the protection of the land that they own, but also having in mind that this is where their livelihoods depend. So we promote also green businesses for the communities to ensure that they benefit from what they're restoring. And that's where the biocredits project comes in. The biocredits is part of the blended finance model that we have for this landscape. The landscape has other programs, but biocredits is one of them as part of the blended finance program. Next slide, please. So the design of our project is summarized in this slide. As Tora said, it's community-owned, designed, and implemented. I'll explain this further in the next slide. But we develop these programs based on the visions of the communities. So it's not that we tell them, yes, we have a biocredits project, let's start. No, these communities all have visions. So we start with their visions. That's where we start to check on their visions and how they align with the requirements of the project based on the Plan Vivo standard. And then we develop theories of change, which is the next table. We develop theories of change, which are complete with monitoring plans of the indicators of the outputs that we have set as a community. The development of all this is guided by a manual we developed a manual which includes the training, the monitoring for the whole program as a community-based program. And then the monitoring of the resources. Now the monitoring is based on the restoration activities that are going on in the landscape. And all this monitoring is the one that ends in the biocredit certification, as Toro explained. Next slide, please. So to go further into the community engagement program that we go through as a requirement for the Plan Vivo standard, our programs are community owned. Either the land is owned by the community, is managed by the community, and the IPLCs have the ownership and the user rights and the benefits, whether livelihood, whichever livelihood, but also the biocredits that come out. The certificates and the credits also belong to the community itself. The communities are co-investors because the land belongs to them, but we input into the processes, the community engagement processes, the monitoring, the training. There's a lot of training that goes into this to make it community owned, because even the monitoring that's required is done by the communities. The communities have several monitoring programs and they're all done by the community, but through intensive training. The program is community designed and we use the gender action learning methodology systems, which ensures maximum participation of the communities. This methodology, we call it the girls in short methodologies. And it ensures that communities own this. It's very engaging, participatory, lively, and the communities feel, in the end, the communities feel that they own whatever we are implementing with them. And it's based on their visions. Their visions are set general visions. They include the home development, they include restoration actions, they include the biodiversity and the livelihood related. So all these actions that they have are what we develop into the project idea notes and the project development document that are required by Plan Vivo. And then the implementation involves the interventions that the communities do. These are mainly restoration interventions, which are tree planting where we have the active planting. We have the active planting in areas where we'll do the stacking of the carbon credits and the biocredits. There's that program as well in option in Plan Vivo, where Toro hasn't gone in detail, but yes, we can discuss that in another forum. Then there is also maintenance of the already existing forest. There is protection to reduce the illegal activities, to protect the already planted forests, protect the resources and all the programs that are already there. The patrolling or reducing all this is done by the communities, but also the livelihood projects are implemented by the communities with support from EcoTrust, mainly in business development training, proposal writing, and then fundraising for their businesses. That one we support, but the implementation of all this is done by the communities. The monitoring is done through community-based monitoring approach, which involves both the traditional transect monitoring, but also the digital monitoring that was mentioned as a requirement for the Plan Vivo standard. And then the certificates are also owned by the communities, and they agree on the benefit sharing scheme that they are going to take as a community. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, there's intensive training in this, and most of the funding that has been used has gone into training. This has to be community owned. So for us, we trained. Training and community engagement is what takes most of the time in the Plan Vivo programs, because we have to ensure that the communities are capable of implementing these programs. So we've done lots of training, both digital and traditional monitoring training, using the apps that support the data management. And the information that these communities develop is presented back to them in formats that they understand. So through the training, we also do active monitoring, which is also done by communities, but through our training. Next slide, please. So this is one of the ways that we present these results in pictorial formats, which are understandable by the communities, and then you explain them. Now, this is a dissimilarity tree, which shows how close the sites, different sites are to the desired site, and the communities would want all their sites to be closer to the desired. So it's something easy for them to understand, and they will want for their communities to move to where the desired site is, and that's how we present this to the communities. Next slide, please. So the biocredits project was overlaid onto as I told you, the communities do their traditional monitoring. So the biocredits came in just to introduce the digital monitoring. And the way we introduced it is that we told the communities this monitoring is introducing another monitoring that will discover what we can't find on the transects. So it's a layer added to the monitoring, but it generates extra revenue from the credits because as we monitor the digital monitoring as required by the biocredits, that's where we certify the requirements of the standard, and it will bring more funding into their program. But it also expands the livelihood options by finding more green businesses based on the livelihoods that can be supported by the biodiversity discovered. And then it's aimed at capturing what we can't find, what is missed. So this is the language that we use with the communities. It captures what we miss on the transects. But it also had to be accepted by the communities through a proper FP process, where the communities will either accept to participate or accept these digital recorders on their land. And we go through that process until the communities are happy to have these digital recorders on their land. Next slide, please. So the benefit sharing model ensures that the money from the biocredits doesn't come to the individual members of the communities, but it goes into processes. It goes into restoration actions, into supportive actions of ensuring land tenure and management planning, and also business planning for their livelihoods. It goes into control actions of monitoring and fire management, but also in rewards and compensation, where we have the PACE program, where we have small grants supporting their businesses. And so these are some of the businesses that the communities have on the land. Mainly, we've promoted the apiary because it promotes restoration, and that's the highest one, the commonest that we have in our programs, but also the tree nursery to support the restoration program. So briefly, that's the Ugandan project. And yes, I'll hand over. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Diana.
Well, thanks very much, everybody, for being here today. And thank you to the Global Rewilding Alliance for creating this learning space for us today, and certainly to those who've made time for the webinar. VERRA, you may or may not know, is a US-based nonprofit organization, and we are a global standard setter with certification programs for carbon, for plastics, and for sustainable development, which is our focus today with the Nature Framework. Next slide, please. So the Nature Framework was launched in late October last year at the United Nations CBD COP in Colombia. And that was following a development process of over 2 years with a core group of collaborating stakeholders, including, among many others, the Biodiversity Consultancy, Conservation International, and the Conservation Finance Alliance. And supported by a much larger consultative advisory group made up of scientists, conservation practitioners, other project developers, and a variety of other stakeholders. So it was quite an intensive development process. The Nature Framework is a methodology for generating certified high-integrity nature credits, otherwise known as biodiversity credits, but we call them nature credits under the Nature Framework. And the Nature Framework as a methodology is situated under VERRA's SD Vista program. That's our Sustainable Development Verified Impact Standard. So that's our program for certifying sustainable development benefits, of which biodiversity is one. Eligible activities under the nature framework include activities for avoiding loss of biodiversity as well as restoring biodiversity. And what we have seen often, more than any others in our piloting cohort, is a combination of both. We see many projects that are to some degree avoiding loss of intact or high quality biodiversity and also restoring degraded landscapes at the same time. Next slide, please. So what is a nature credit? Well, it reflects 3 dimensions of the state of nature. It reflects extent, ecosystem condition, and significance, but only the first 2 of those are factored into the quantification approach. So quality hectares are calculated as the area weighted change in ecosystem condition over a period of time. And that change is measured against a crediting baseline, which we will talk about a few slides from now, and scaled by 100, so that 1 nature credit is 1% of the net biodiversity outcomes, again, measured in quality hectares, that are generated by a project's activities during a defined monitoring period. And that part of things is quite important to avoid double counting of any biodiversity gains over a project's lifetime. The quantification of nature credits is bound to that particular period of time. In the context of the nature framework, that has to happen at least once every 5 years, but it could happen more frequently. But after a particular monitoring period ends, the quantification process starts over again so that no gains previously achieved are credited a second time. That's the principle of double counting, avoiding double counting. Biodiversity significance is not embedded in the quantification, rather it's reflected externally, and that is to help credit investors understand the project's contributions to the global biodiversity framework targets. So a project will report on how it is preserving and or restoring ecosystems, how it may be conserving underrepresented biodiversity, or how it may be reducing species extinctions, and in some cases, maybe ticking multiple boxes. So again, significance is an external marker on a nature credit. It's not something that is embedded in the quantification approach. Next slide, please. So I'll walk us through a high-level overview of some of the key nature framework requirements without getting into too much detail. But this slide presents on the left the time-bound elements that are relevant. So a project defines its start date in as early as January 1st of 2023, which is when we began the development process for the nature framework, or of course at any point later, but it is possible to look back and set a historical start date, provided certain conditions are met. What is important in terms of timing elements is that a project must have at least a minimum of 20-year crediting period and project longevity. And that can be renewed up to 4 times. So the project crediting period or project lifetime could be up to 100 years. And then you see on the right side some additional core elements of project design. And these are very much related to SD Vista's focus on the sustainable development context, as well as the framework's overarching focus on integrity. So starting with a baseline scenario, projects are required to use a very comprehensive risk assessment, which is embedded in a set of requirements referred to as social and environmental safeguards. And that helps the project to determine where there are areas of risk that need to be mitigated, whether those are to stakeholders' livelihoods, for example, other environmental concerns. And then that assessment becomes the basis for a causal chain analysis, which helps the project to define the sustainable development objectives. So again, we're looking not only at biodiversity, but we're looking at sustainable development more broadly, thinking about both people and the planet. And that causal chain analysis also supports how a project maps out its activities, the expected outputs and outcomes, and the impacts that it wants to generate, as well as thinking through how it must mitigate or how it must address any potential negative impacts that have been identified in the risk assessment. And then finally, as Toril touched on briefly in our very opening slides, the nature framework also has requirements around additionality. So that is saying that the biodiversity outcomes and the nature credits wouldn't have occurred without the Nature Credit Finance, without the Nature Framework project. Next slide, please. And so now we'll just walk through some of the key technical elements of Nature Framework project design, again, without getting too deep in the weeds, although we'll, of course, be more than happy to answer questions about that later. But a project first needs to establish its boundary. That's this dotted line here, which is the wider area of impact where the project's activities are going to influence that overarching sustainable development context. So within the project boundary, for example, again, we can refer back to livelihoods, we can refer back to other sorts of stakeholder impacts, and thinking more broadly about the sustainable development context beyond biodiversity alone. And then you see those green circles there, that is the extent. So those are the actual physical areas in hectares where project activities take place and the biodiversity outcomes are monitored and quantified. So those are sort of the spatial requirements that are relevant for Nature Framework projects. Next slide, please. One back. Thank you very much. And so how do we monitor ecosystem condition in the Nature Framework? Well, when we think about the quality of biodiversity that's present in the project extent, the Nature Framework takes an ecosystem level approach. So it asks projects to look at both flora and fauna, using at a minimum 5 required indicators. So 3 indicators of composition and 2 indicators of structure. But the framework doesn't specify exactly what those indicators must be because they are, of course, going to vary substantially from ecosystem to ecosystem. They're going to vary substantially from project context from one to another. And so we require that project proponents define the indicators that are most appropriate for their ecosystem, most reflective of the change that their activities are intended to generate, and most appropriate for the project's capacity to monitor. And those proposed indicators have to be accompanied by scientific justification and an appropriate defense for their selection. Projects can monitor more than those minimum of 5 if they choose to, but it is the 5 minimum that are required by the framework. Projects can also monitor ecosystem function, but that particular indicator is not included in the quantification. And then each indicator is also associated with a reference value. And so the project proponent must also define or set that reference value for each indicator they choose. So for example, if a project says they're going to monitor bird species diversity in a tropical forest ecosystem, they need to set an associated reference value, and that value reflects what is the optimal value for that indicator in that particular ecosystem in a scenario where the ecosystem is intact or as untouched as possible. And the use of that reference value is serving 2 purposes. So it standardizes the measurements, which helps to aid comparability. Of course, when we think about a globally relevant methodology that is quantifying biodiversity across all different types of ecosystems, different types of project activities, using a reference state for standardization helps to aid the comparison across project types. But we also saw in some analyses in the development process that using a reference value helps to lower the risk of over-crediting. So it brings the quantification down just a little bit, which is what we want to see. We always want to take a conservative approach in our quantification and credit finance generation. And so finally, the standardized values of all of a project's condition indicators are combined and they're weighted by that extent in hectares, and that's what produces the quality hectare measure. Next slide, please. The overarching monitoring requirements ask that project proponents provide in a comprehensive monitoring plan, which does include monitoring the sustainable development context as well as biodiversity. And that sampling protocol should address the condition indicators that they've selected. The framework at the moment has a set of high-level requirements for defining and designing that sampling protocol, but again, it needs to be appropriate for the condition indicators, appropriate for the ecosystem context and the project context. And that sampling protocol, the indicators and the reference values that are set also undergo technical expert assessment as part of the certification process. So as they're assembling their sampling protocol and part of their monitoring plan, project proponents must define the spatial scale and sampling areas, identify sample sites, define the sampling effort and frequency, as well as what are the most suitable and credible sampling methods. And the latter two could be different across indicators, of course. We know that the sampling frequency for one indicator could be more or less than another. And their entire sampling protocol, just as with the selection of indicators and reference values, should be supported with scientific justification. Next slide, please. And so the final technical element to touch on, and I really will just touch on it at this point, is the crediting baseline element, which is a technical element that influences the nature credit quantification. And a crediting baseline is essentially an estimation or a projection of the likely loss of ecosystem condition or biodiversity in the absence of the project and its activities. So it's really a calculation or a projection of what might happen to biodiversity in the project extent if it weren't for the project to be there. And this is a very challenging thing to do. As you would imagine, we tried for over 2 years to create one standardized approach to do this across all ecosystems, but really just discovered at the end of that very long and intensive process that there are big gaps in biodiversity data across the globe. And so in the Nature Framework, we present 3 different methods that projects can use for this particular technical element. And the method that they choose is dependent on data availability, since that was the big limiting factor that we encountered in the development process. So the box there on the right is just a summary of those steps. The project situates itself within the country ecoregion component that's relevant. They conduct an inventory of the available data related to the 5 condition indicators, at least, that they're monitoring within their project, and also assess that data availability against some temporal and spatial criteria. So the framework requires historical data for the last 10 years at a resolution of at least 300 meters. There is a decision tree tool in the framework to help projects identify the most appropriate of the 3 methods that are there. And at the project start, or at the start of any given monitoring period, an estimated crediting baseline is calculated. And then at verification, when biodiversity outcomes are verified, the project essentially recalculates that crediting baseline with the most up-to-date data available. So it's an approach that we're taking in a dynamic fashion. So really to promote integrity, despite the fact that there's data gaps, and again, to reduce the risk of overcrediting. So taking a conservative approach with this particular technical element that does have an impact on quantification. Next slide, please. And so in wrapping up, we've been working with a wonderful cohort of global pilot projects since late 2023, and we're now supporting the first wave of Nature Framework projects to pursue document submission, excuse me, to submit their documentation in pursuit of registration. And that first wave of projects will be limited to existing pilots, but we will open the Nature Framework widely for all projects starting in the 4th quarter of this year. So we're busy establishing the operational elements for the Nature Framework's rollout. We are assembling a technical expert panel that will support evaluation of some of those key elements of project design that I mentioned. And that is in addition to the third-party auditing that happens with the VVBs. And at the same time, we're also approving competent VVBs to audit Nature Framework projects. So ensuring that they have not only the expertise around biodiversity related to ecology, biology, et cetera, but also the appropriate social science expertise to be able to evaluate the sustainable development requirements and elements of project design. And then our intention going forward is to continue to test and refine the framework using project's real monitoring data as it comes in. And we are treating this very first version of the Nature Framework as a testing version in that regard. And really looking forward to seeing those first projects in the pipeline as this new biodiversity market takes shape. So last slide, please. And if you're feeling very ambitious, you're more than welcome to read the full nature framework. And of course, I'll share my contact details in the chat as well, if there happen to be any further technical questions after the webinar. But that's all for me. Thank you very much for your time. We can hand over now to Jill.
Thank you, Alistair. And thank you, Amy. We're really glad to be here with you today. Maybe you could go ahead and go forward to the next slide. So we're here today to talk about ARC Restore Azuero, which is Pontera's flagship project in Panama on the Azuero Peninsula. And so if you look there in the little white square, that's the Azuero Peninsula. And the dark green is the mature forest, and the yellow, as you can see, it's quite extensive, is the deforested areas. So most of Azuero looks like that, and it looks like the cattle pasture picture at the bottom left of the slide. We find some degree of secondary forest and mature forest, but to a far lesser degree. And so the goal of the project is to restore 10,000 hectares of this degraded cattle ranching land to moist, diverse, tropical forests. But the forest here has a hard time recovering. And that's due to the presence of not only cattle, but also human pressures, people cleaning their land with fire, machetes, pesticides. And so what we do under the project is that we lease land from private landowners for restoration. And we also provide a credit share to support permanence and partnership. That's for both carbon and for biodiversity. So we're using a combination of active restoration, where we plant 30 different tree species, and also assisted natural regeneration, which ends up supporting over 100 tree species across the landscape. And as far as the carbon project is concerned, this is the element of biodiversity that we primarily work with. We're pursuing carbon credits under VERRA's VM47 methodology, and we're planning to stack biodiversity credits with the SD Vista Nature Framework, both to monitor biodiversity improvement, but also to help with extra income and incentives for the landowners in our project. So with that, let me turn you over to the real authority here. That's our friend Hubert. He's our ecologist and biodiversity leader, and he's going to tell you how we implement this important work.
All right, next slide, please. So my task is monitoring biodiversity across Pontera's project and kind of developing a system that Pontera can use in Panama and beyond. We're starting this in Mexico as well. So we're in somewhat of a unique situation among the pilots, I believe, because we started designing this system before we joined as a pilot project, before we knew what biodiversity methodology we would use. And our goal from the start was understanding biodiversity at a landscape scale, what will it take, and also understanding what level of biodiversity monitoring we would need to do going forward. So we intentionally oversampled in terms of different indicators and in terms of sampling intensity that we implemented. So you can see in the top right, that's one of the contracted land areas. Our biodiversity monitoring system is oriented around a grid of points, kind of taken from the random encounter model used for mammal camera trapping. At each point, we have a mammal camera trap. We have a passive acoustic sensor. We have a botanist that does a gentry transect for trees as well as invasive grasses. We have soil samples that we're collecting. We have an ornithologist that does bird point counts. So most of our sampling is oriented around this grid of points. Next slide, please. So where are we now? We have sampled 100 points across the landscape. This is a representative of 1,000 hectares of particular fincas. Fincas are the word that people use here for the particular land areas. So far, we have over 4,000 camera days worth of mammal camera trap data. So for those that don't know, camera days are one camera at one location for one day is a camera day. So 10 cameras for 10 days would be 100 camera days. We also have thousands of hours of acoustic data, more than 10,000 individual organisms that we have documented that represent more than 400 species. So for our soil invertebrates, we're not going down to species level. So likely this number is far greater. And we have another 100 points planned for later this year. Next slide, please. So we have been incredibly successful with our biodiversity monitoring on the ground. We have a great team that composed of Panamanians that we have trained and who are training others as well. We're working with local universities. to kind of source our talent as well as community members. And we have collected an incredible data set that will help us refine our restoration approach, kind of helping hand in hand the carbon and the biodiversity, as well as contribute to biodiversity science. Like I mentioned earlier, we're oversampling now to kind of get an idea of what are the most cost-effective means of monitoring biodiversity across this kind of landscape. I think that question hasn't been answered by science quite yet, so we're trying to kind of get at that. One of our challenges with regards to this is choosing which indicators we want for the actual biodiversity crediting. As Amy mentioned, we have a minimum requirement of 5 indicators for getting biodiversity credits, but we are measuring more than 30. So now we have a choice before us. Which indicators do we choose for the actual credit generation? So here it's kind of a balance where the landowners want to see money coming in from biodiversity credits sooner rather than later, but not all indicators are likely to change in the next few years. Some might take decades to change. So we're still having conversations and deciding exactly how that will play out. We're also trying to understand which reference values we should use because our system has not been heavily studied, the Azuero Peninsula where we're located. And this is also an issue for the crediting baseline. So we don't have a lot of historical data specifically where our project is. So we're trying to understand how to make that happen. Thankfully, natural regeneration is really strong in our system if you keep the fire out, if you keep the cows out, if you make sure that the landowners are happy with that arrangement. Everybody loves the forest. Even these cattle ranchers that are many generations of cattle ranchers, they love seeing the macaws flying in. They love their forests, and they clear the land because that's what they need to. So if all of these things are in place, the forest comes back, and we've seen this starting among our pilot project. So very thankful for that. We'll end on a little fun challenge that we have to deal with. That's, in my experience, pretty unique to the Azuero Peninsula: abundant tick bombs. So for those of you that don't know, tick bombs are these accumulations of freshly hatched ticks that if you hit one of them while you're walking, you are suddenly covered in thousands of ticks. And we've had last year during the dry season, at least one member of the crew every single day hit a tick bomb. So something we've been dealing with. All right. That's it for us.
Thank you very much, Hubert. And on to Preeti.
Yes.
Preeti, are you there? Are you ready?
Yes, I'm here. Hi. Hi to everyone. I'm here to present our project in the Coa Valley, which is in Portugal. With me is Andre Couto from Rewilding Portugal, and I am Preeti from Wildaway. Yeah, on to the next slide. Just to introduce ourselves, who are we? Wildaway is a private company who is working towards transforming land management over 100 hectares and hopefully thousands of hectares for the benefit of nature and climate. The aim of the company is to make rewilding financially competitive land use by showing that it is investable and to enable restoration on a large scale. And it's also, the company wants to enhance the commercial viability of these rewilding initiatives, which is not only in Portugal, but in several areas in Europe, and to help the sale of nature and carbon credits to the voluntary market. Rewilding Portugal is a non-profit organization established in 2019 in Guarda. They have a mission to promote nature conservation through rewilding measures in Portugal and currently focused in the Greater Coa Valley landscape. And they are partners of Rewilding Europe, and they work towards the whole rewilding agenda. Next slide. Yeah. So to introduce the project itself, the goal of the project is to promote natural processes and heterogeneity in a mosaic Mediterranean landscape. The location of the project is in the Greater Coa Valley, which is in somewhere between Spain and Portugal. The initial project areas, there are 2 sites, approximately around 700 hectares. It's called Hermos de Aguias and Valle Carapito. The whole project boundary is around 300,000 hectares, and we are going for a group project approach where we hope to expand the rewilding efforts into the larger landscape. Next slide, please. The location of the project is in the northeastern part of Portugal, between the border region between Portugal and Spain, where in the northern part you have the Douro River, and to the south is the Malcata mountain range. The Rewilding Europe and Rewilding Portugal have been active in this region, and they're working towards reviving the ecological functions and the trophic chains and bringing back species, and also enabling corridor connectivity. As you see in the map here with the green borders, that is the whole project boundary. And the areas within are the areas where Rewilding Portugal is currently active. 2 of these areas are now within the nature framework proposal, and there'll be more areas hopefully in the future that join the project. Next slide, please. To talk a little bit about the project sites, these are the 2 sites. One is around 600 hectares and the other is around 70 hectares. The main biome is Mediterranean forest, woodlands, and scrub. And within this, there are 2 ecoregions, which is the Iberian montane forest and Iberian sclerophyllus semi-deciduous forest. Although it's described as forest, there are multiple ecosystems within these extents because it's a mosaic landscape. You have woodlands, you have grasslands and scrublands within these project extents and also within the whole project boundary. I think this is one of the big challenges in the project itself, is how to bring these ecosystems together and how do you make biodiversity outcomes and how do you envision rewilding in this landscape. Next slide. Yeah, to talk a little bit about the activities that we do on the ground. The main activities are reinforcement of population of keystone species, and this includes at the moment reintroduction of large semi-wild grazers such as tauros and horses in the landscape. This is mainly to facilitate natural processes from grazing that can help with reducing fires and can also regenerate the vegetation in the area. The second activity is woodland restoration. This includes natural regeneration as well as some efforts to curtail non-native species in the area and bring back native species into the woodland areas. The third is managing fires through surveillance and management, and this includes a lot of activities in the area by the local communities, but also by the Rewilding Portugal team to help reduce the severity of fires and to understand what are the activities that can be done in order to inform people about fire management. The fourth one is curtailing extractive activities in the rewilding areas, and this means allowing, for example, dead wood to remain in the woodlands, or allowing to reduce to a certain extent the amount of poaching or the amount of extraction from the natural areas themselves. And the last is managing and reducing human-wildlife conflict. And this is more related to the comeback of predators because the landscape in the Coa Valley is reviving on its own to a certain extent. But it is also nice to have some iconic species, which for us would be the lynx and the wolf in the area. There are certain concerns for the local community, and Rewilding Portugal works towards informing them and making them aware about the benefits of having these species in the landscape, and also providing some damage prevention measures to mitigate any conflicts. On the project, the start date of the project will be from last year, that is January 2024. And the project period will be around 20 years. Hopefully, we renew it more times in the future. Next slide, please. To look a bit into what we are monitoring on the ground already. we stuck to the 5 indicators that we needed to use for the nature framework. And this is distribution. This is briefly around fauna and flora species diversity. We go with understanding what is the distribution of herbivores and predators in the landscape. So we look at functional diversity indices, and we also want, to a certain extent, depending on the quality of the data, we look at either occupancy or diversity. And we do this through camera trapping mainly. And for flora species diversity, we look at both trees and plants, and this means we also look at the grasslands and the scrublands to see what is the diversity of the species and abundance of these species in the landscape. And this is done through exclosures and vegetation plots to see the changes in within grazing and non-grazing areas so that we understand what is the difference. And in the same way, we also measure what is the change in the structure of the habitat as a result of grazing and less fires. And that means there will be an effect on how the vegetation changes over time. And in the end, last one is the soil structure. We want to look at the composition of the soil as a result of grazing and the restoration actions on the ground. In terms of the crediting baseline approach, we haven't decided yet. We are still looking into what is the data available in the region or in the vicinity of the project area. We either would go with a habitat risk conversion method or an ecological rate of change, which means we either choose with the data that is available to go with structure or composition indicator that is most relevant for the project. The next slide, please. In terms of successes and challenges, one of the main successes is we know that rewilding and restoration actions on the ground already show some positive effects on biodiversity. And we know this because there has been some ongoing monitoring in the landscape through the years. So we are happy with this success. And some of the main challenges, I think, is shared by a lot of the cohorts, is to find the right indicators on habitat structure, especially because being in a mosaic landscape, it's very hard to find what is the right indicator for habitat that is stable over time, because habitat structure is constantly changing and it's more challenging in a mosaic landscape. The second one is aligning the project to the start date. That is a requirement of the methodology because some of the activities already occurred before, and we still have to account for the change that happened before the start date as well. The last one is gathering evidence on reference values and crediting baseline. Because as Amy mentioned, there is a bit of dearth of data availability on this. So we have to find the most relevant values for the entire region, hopefully. The last slide, please. Why we would like to go for the nature credit. What is our main required in terms of nature credit financing? Why do we want to do nature credits? Is 3 main reasons. First, to finance ongoing activities such as ongoing management and monitoring of the project. There is a bit of donor funding that is available for a short period of time, but if we want to continue the project for a longer time period and adapt management practices, then nature credits is a useful mechanism. The second is to have a proof of concept for the local community in the region that rewilding can be an alternative source of income, and because of the sale of nature credits. And the last is to scale up rewilding and bring more permanence to the projects and for a longer time period. Yeah, this is our project in brief. Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Preeti. So thank you all to all the speakers. It's been amazing sort of journey both into the technical world of biodiversity credits and, you know, an amazing amount of complexity really just to try and cut through this system and provide new finance for nature recovery and rewilding. It's been amazing to understand the systems, and also to travel into these various geographies to see how you are actually implementing this in reality and getting ready for biodiversity credits. So without further ado, no more needed from me. Over to you, Mark. Mark Haller is the chair of the Global Rewilding Alliance and has very kindly agreed to sum up. Mark.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Alistair, and thanks so much to all of the presenters. I think that was an absolutely fascinating series of presentations, and I can tell you that I myself have learned a great deal. I actually was thinking as listening to that each of those presentations probably merited a webinar on its own, because there's so many issues, there's so much experimentation going on. One of the things that's really nice, actually quite fun about the biodiversity credit world is that it's new and it's in that sort of steep innovation phase. We have started to do very serious work on it, laying the basis for what many of you have called high integrity markets, and I'll come back to that because that word is important. And working out the methodological challenges, working out usable programs, experimenting on the ground. So I think it's really good that we held this webinar, because so much is happening, and that I think was obvious from all of the presentations. It's also very useful, I think, to all of us to speak to you who are actually working at the coalface on this, actually trying to iron out the issues, trying to work out what the best indicators are, trying to calculate in a robust way the sort of biodiversity lift connected to the project interventions that you're doing. I say that it's new, but in a sense, the biodiversity credit market development benefits from the lessons learned from voluntary carbon markets. And when I say that, I say we have learned both from the successful aspects of those markets, but also, and probably more, from the problems that they faced. And so we can approach biodiversity carbon markets or nature credit markets on the basis of avoiding the mistakes that have been made too often in respect of carbon. And I think that the insistence on high integrity is a reference to the fact that very often the carbon markets proved not to have the integrity necessary. So I think that it's possible for us coming later to sort of avoid some of the mistakes. Now, I think we're all very well aware of the challenges that exist in setting up biodiversity credit schemes. The obvious one is that there's no equivalent to the ton of carbon, and that in fact we all have to work with multiple factors and multiple indicators, and that the biodiversity or nature is very different in different parts of the world, and therefore very difficult to compare. But I think that it's obvious that we have learned a number of those lessons, and I'll just mention two factors from these presentations that I think represent that learning. The first is the emphasis on really clear sharing of the benefits from biodiversity credits, that the 60% of the benefits distributed back to the communities or the equivalent of that. This did not take place in the carbon world and led to a lot of the sort of unpopularity of some of these carbon schemes at the local level. I think we all know that biodiversity cannot be conserved without the active participation of local communities, and so it's just that they see the benefits coming back to them from the efforts that they make on the basis of the robust schemes that you are putting together. The other lesson that we've learned is the danger of offsetting, and here biodiversity credit markets might in a future stage accept offsets, but I think it's right that for good governance and for high integrity, offsets are not part of the biodiversity market schemes that we're seeing so far. There's still a lot of unknowns. Gregor led by saying that part of the reason we're involved in this is that we're trying to meet the challenge of raising the necessary money to implement the global biodiversity framework and to meet our conservation needs at a time when development funding and public funding is sinking. But I think we don't yet know the extent of the markets. We don't yet really have a clear idea of the demand for biodiversity credits and how those might evolve. Two final words. One is that since I represent the Global Rewilding Alliance, I think that the link between the boom in rewilding projects and interest in rewilding projects and the potential for applying biodiversity credits is really enormous. So I think that I hope we will see many more of the rewilding projects, such as the Koa Valley project, included in biodiversity credit schemes, because rewilding is doing exactly what biodiversity credits were designed to encourage. The final thing is that I think this will really take off when we advance in the development and application of a nature equivalent to net zero carbon, often called by the nature positive standard. And that's a parallel effort that's going on right now. But if a credible nature positive standard were developed and implemented, it would have the effect of creating large markets for biodiversity credit. So I hope that we can count on your efforts leading to what you called in the beginning a market characterized by high integrity, and that the markets, the interest in biodiversity credit markets will continue to grow as we realize the extent of the nature-based risks that we are facing in our economies and in our societies. So with that, let me just thank you all for a series of really fascinating presentations. As I said in the beginning, I learned a great deal from them, and I'm sure many of the others have as well. Sorry that we didn't manage to allow time for a discussion, but I think that there was so much content in the presentations that we can go back and think them through, and Alistair has mentioned that we will try to collate the questions and get back to you with them. And with that, thanks, Alistair, for chairing. Thanks to all the presenters, and thanks to all of you for your presence and your comments. All of the best.
Thanks everyone for coming, and that was great. And just if you're interested in the Global Rewilding Alliance, go to globalrewilding.earth. We are an alliance of rewilding organizations, as the name suggests. We are currently 248, operating in 125 countries, influencing a land area about half the size equivalent of the United States, and twice that area in the oceans, about 5 million square kilometers in the oceans. So it's an amazing group of organizations working together, learning from each other, and working to our mission, which is to mainstream rewilding in science, policy, and practice by 2030. Thanks all for coming, and see you soon.